the best we can and think about it, right? So Job starts off, and in the first chapter of Job, what does God say about Job? What does he say about him? He's faithful, he's blameless and upright, he's a good man, right? And then what's Satan's response? Do you remember how the accuser, how Satan himself responds to God? Yeah, he wants to mess him up. And he says, does Job serve you for nothing, God? I mean, the implication is that, well, yeah, of course Job loves you. You've given him all these great blessings. He's rich and has lots of kids, of course he serves you. And so what ensues is the rest of the book of Job. And so Job loses everything, in chapters 1 and 2. And then in chapter 3, we read his lament, just how he curses the day he was born and all the pain that he suffered. And then what ensues is a debate, a discussion, a wrestling with how to understand it all, right? And the implication of this book is that Job and his three friends are the wisest old guys around. You couldn't find anybody wiser than these four. And so they're going through it. And how would you summarize Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz's speeches? What was their idea? What was their points? All their words, how would you summarize them? What are some high points of their speeches?
Job, you did something. We don't know what you did, but you did.
Yeah, the biggest point, right, is based on your obvious the state you're in, we can extrapolate from that you are sinful, Job. And so what else would they say? Since you're sinful, what would they try and push him and convince him to do? Yeah, confess your sins. Just tell us what you did and tell God and everything will be all right. And they would use many different kind of authorities or arguments or ways to basically make the same point, that Job is sinful and therefore he must confess. And even through this, as they would argue more and more, they would start to paint some even kind of overly black and white pictures of God or kind of even dark visions of who God is and what he's like. They proved to be pretty foolish in the wisdom they shared ultimately. In the middle of this, in chapter 28, in the very middle of the book, we get this poem, this praise of wisdom. There's a mine for gold and jewels, but where can wisdom be found? And then Job gets his final defense in chapters 29 to 31, where he reiterates his blamelessness. And then in chapter 31 is where he goes through and says, if I've done this or this or this, then God, please punish me. Or if I've done this or that, then God, please punish me. And it's kind of Job's final, he's even speaking to God saying, hey, just show me where I've gone wrong. Show me why I deserve this, Lord. And then Elihu, the young gun, who's been silent the whole time, he finally speaks up. That's what we looked at last week. And in my opinion, we don't get a commentary, unlike the other three. We don't really get a commentary on Elihu. God doesn't comment on it at the end. We're left up to our own judgment. And we had a discussion about that last week. Personally, I find Elihu wanting still. He has a lot of anger as he starts off. In the ways he talks about his knowledge and God's knowledge, he talks about them very similarly, if not the same. And ultimately, he doesn't give an answer that's much different than the three friends. And so what I'm left with up to this point before God speaks is the old wise guys have no answers. The young wise guy has a lot of anger and a lot of brashness. He doesn't have an answer. And if we're reading up to this point, and the discussions up to this point, we're left, if we didn't have the commentary from God, what we're seeing among these wise guys is there's no answer. Why is Job suffering like this? No one knows. And I think it's good before God speaks to kind of take a beat and appreciate reappreciate just the place that will put Job in. He's faithfully served God his whole life, and he's confident of that. Like he knows, and he even wants to be corrected. If I'm wrong, God, then show me. He's looking for the ways to be corrected, and yet nobody can give him an answer that really is believable because everyone's wrong, in effect. And even Job has said some things that aren't really right along these lines through this all. And so when the Lord shows up in chapter 38, I think that it's a pretty exciting turn of events in the book because finally we're going to see God speak and what his thoughts are to all of this. Anything else to think about or to point out in the summary of all this up till now? Jesse?
Is it wrong to think that their understanding actually makes sense? Mm-hmm. Right? Like, this is such a weird situation.
Yeah.
Like, this is, like, unfathomable setup
Yeah.
for this whole play.
Yeah.
Right? So, and they don't know the backstory. They don't know the like kind of behind the scenes stuff that happened there to set this up. So sometimes I think we land really hard on his friends for just thinking that they're so smart and so wrong at the same time. But
Yeah.
I don't know what other conclusion really that they should have come up with without having divine knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. And that's such a good point to remind ourselves of. And it's tough. Like, I totally agree. And yet I also, like, when I see some of the harsh things they said, some of the dark things they said, and some of the appeals they made, I had a dream that told me this. And it's like, who told you that in that dream? Because that's not true. You know, like, and so it's, I agree. And also, but yet it's still hard not to commiserate. It's like both are true. Like the deep misery Job's already in, and his friends are saying all kinds of nonsense. It's like only deepens the misery. And yet from their perspective, they're trying to help, you know? And that's been one of the big lessons I think we've seen time and time again is the humility we must have as people who believe in God, knowing that we're always smaller than his wisdom. You know, we don't know the whys of every situation. But I do think there is some sympathy that, you know, at least we ought to have humility as we approach the four friends and their perspectives, because it's very easy to fall into that trap. Jennifer?
I know at work I would look at people or what they did, and it's something that you work at instead of going, well, you know, he's a drug addict and he's stealing again, and or even little things that happen, you go, well, what did they do in their life to get there?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that's the whole point of the book almost, is that we better be careful and just be looking at people in love and praying for them.
Yeah.
And it's the ways of the world. Like, nobody here, when I have problems, nobody here would address me the way people in the world do and say, oh, well, you should do this and you should do that. And, well, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
And so it's very comforting to be here.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I agree with that. I think there is a lot.
And even when everything got restored double to him, you think of him losing all his children. I'm sure his children, you know, he still remembered personality traits and good things that his children did. I'm sure they were never forgotten. There was always hurt in his heart, no matter how much he loved God.
Yeah.
And that's a good example for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much pain in all of this, and yet you're right. Like, as we start to examine how to interact with these things, you know, I believe that too, and I'm sure that's the case, and I've seen it be the case, that people are, you know, we have a comforting group, there's an encouragement to be found among God's people. But I've also, you know, on the other side, not this group, but I've heard stories, you know, of people, you know, when we think someone's kid has gone wayward, saying, well, hey, have you read this proverb? You know, raise up a child the way he shall go. When they're old, they shall not depart from it. Well, what did you do, mom and dad? You know, like preachers or elders or fellow Christians kind of, and if they don't say it to the Christian's face, they'll say it behind their backs, you know. And that's very much what I see. Again, a lot of the things the three friends said, it's found in Proverbs. And a lot of the things we might say about each other or to each other, we could, hey, here's book, chapter, verse. What happened here, you know? And I think that there is wisdom to be found in this and warning to be found in this. And yet, there's also, we ought to be involved in each other's lives, not as busybodies or gossips or, you know, all these things, but we ought to be involved in encouraging each other and knowing what's going on and being of service to each other. And I think that's the heart that, I have to imagine that's the heart these three friends had. But they just got it wrong. Anyway, let's continue on to God's speech, because he's going to have some things to say, of course. So, as God appears in verse 1, look at this. In Job 38, verse 1, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Why do you think that God speaks out of the whirlwind? And what significance do storms have in relation to God and his power in the rest of the Bible? This is, believe it or not, shows up everywhere in the Bible. The storm, and God speaking from the storm, or being in the storm. But why do you think about this? Why do you think he speaks out of the whirlwind? What significance might that have, and how might Job and his friends have thought about it? Ricky?
I also, you know, the burning bush.
Yeah.
You know, Moses. That's the only way that we can even, you know, hear God. I think, because if we was in his presence, we would die.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's
So it's a sobering thought
Yeah.
that he lowered just enough to where we can, and it's still scary.
Yeah.
You know, the whirlwind, whoa. I mean,
Yeah.
the wind starts howling, trees,
Yeah. No, it's definitely pretty frightening, right? There's a lot of fear in this. What else? What significance do we see of this idea of the whirlwind or the storm in the rest of the Bible? Here's some cross-references. Here's some interesting cross-references. Isaiah 29, God speaking this prophecy about his punishment is going to come. Look at verse, the multitude of your enemies will become like fine dust, and it will happen instantly, suddenly. Verse 6, from the Lord of hosts, you will be punished with thunder and earthquake and loud noise, with whirlwind and tempest and the flame of consuming fire. And the multitude of all the nations who wage war against Ariel, even all who wage war against her and her stronghold and who distress her, will be like a dream, a vision of the night. You see, God's going to come as a warrior, but the idea of his kind of divine armor is this whirlwind and tempest with thunder. Again, in Jeremiah 23, who has stood in the counsel of the Lord, that he should see and hear his word, who has given heed to his word and listened? Behold, the storm of the Lord has gone forth in wrath, even a whirling tempest. It will swirl down on the head of the wicked. Nahum 1, verses 2 and 3. A jealous and avenging God is the Lord. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserves wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. In a whirlwind and storm is his way, and clouds of the dust beneath his feet. And again in Zechariah chapter 9, we see this. I will bend Judah as my bow. I will fill the bow with Ephraim. Verse 14, the Lord will peer over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning. The Lord God will blow the trumpet and will march in the storm winds of the south. The Lord of hosts will defend them. What's the picture when God shows up in the whirlwind? What's power, right? But even specifically, what's God doing when he shows up in the whirlwind? Reproving, judging. What else? How else would you put that? Look at this one.
He invokes fear.
Invokes fear. Look at this one too. He's fighting his enemies, right? Whenever God shows up in a whirlwind, he's kind of dressed for battle, is the idea. It seems like in a lot of the pages of the Bible, that's the idea. When God shows up in the whirlwind, he's showing up to fight a battle. Even in Job, chapter 26, Job says this about God. The pillars of heaven tremble and are amazed at his rebuke. He quieted the sea. Verse 13, by his breath the heavens are cleared. His hand has pierced the fleeing serpent. Behold, these are the fringes of his ways, and how faint a word we hear of him. But his mighty thunder, who can understand? There's this appreciation for the power of God even among Job. And yet when he shows up, maybe coincidentally or ironically or surprisingly, just like Job had said earlier, God shows up in the mighty thunder and the whirlwind and the storm. And he shows up as a warrior. And there kind of is a question, I think, if we're reading into this, that this is how he would have seen it, or if this is possible was in their minds, and God shows up as a warrior in the whirlwind, there's maybe one of two thoughts. I'm in trouble, right? Or maybe he's come to vindicate me, right? And this is the heart of Job. Job throughout, if you remember, has been asking, I wish I could talk to God because I would have a thing or two to say to him, and I think my case would be made well if I could see him. And so this becomes the question, how does God actually initially address Job in the next two verses? And how does this interaction go differently than Job imagined it would? Someone want to read these three verses of Job 38 for us? Can I get a volunteer? Go ahead, Ricky.
2 and 3.
Sure.
Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourselves like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me.
Yeah, so how does God initially address Job here?
You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, you're darkening counsel, right? You're speaking out things you don't know. This idea of girding up your loins, this idea of like tucking your shirt into your belt to get ready to work or to run, or to go to, it's one of the first, in the armor of God in Ephesians 6, you gird your loins first. You tuck your shirt in so you can put your armor on. What's kind of the context here when God says gird up your loins like a man or prepare yourself? What does he seem to be saying?
Get ready, sir.
Yeah. And the idea is like, let's talk. Like even the fact that the introduction of God, in every speech that every person gives in this whole book, it says, then this person spoke, then Eliphaz, then Bildad, then Job. And then God shows up and says, then the Lord answered. Like, wait, what? It's just like the same exact wording. In fact, Elihu has a chapter and a half of preamble before he starts talking. God just says the Lord spoke. Like, he's introduced just like everybody else. In some senses, humbler than even Elihu was introduced. He's introduced, and in some senses, you see him, he's taking up a conversation with Job one-to-one, just like the rest of the friends did. We can read this in the whirlwind and all this, and we can say, well, this would have been frightening and scary. I think it would have been. And yet, also, I think we have to see that God's really condescending here. And not in the negative way, like he's being condescending person, but he's literally coming down to Job's level to talk to him. And there is still a lot of huge gap in all this, but the fact that he's going to talk to him, in a sense, we would say, like, hey, let's talk mano a mano, right? Of course, God's not a mano, but the idea here is, like, I'm going to talk to you one-on-one. Let's figure this out. As scary as this is, I do think that there is something here where he doesn't come out hot, in a sense. I mean, think of all the things that Job has said. The ways that he said, God, you're wrong. In this way, God does these dark things. Like, there's things that have been said by Job that have not been positively picturing God. And God doesn't come out just like striking him dead, I think there's something here where God is going to reason with Job even through all of Job's lack of knowledge or even through Job's darkening of his counsel. Anything else about these kind of introduction of God and his start with his speech? No, go ahead, Terry.
I just feel like God is saying, you really want to talk to me?
Yeah.
You don't have the knowledge
Yeah.
that you think you knew, and I'm here to set this straight.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be answering your questions. You're going to be answering mine.
Yes.
That's the feel I get more here than.
I think you're right. But nonetheless, I do think it's interesting that he does take the time to answer it. You know what I mean? Like, there is something here where it's like, being well familiar with this book for me, sometimes I'm like, well, of course he answers. And it's like, it's not, of course. Like, God comes to him, and there's a grace in this, even though he is going to take him, he's going to say, prepare, you better get ready for this. This is going to be, this is.
He came with his power.
Exactly. Yeah. Mike, what were you going to say?
Same thing. By words without knowledge, and who gives this darkened counsel?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, here's your place.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
Yes. Yeah. And so this is, do you think this goes differently even than Job imagined it would? Just for my way of reminder, here's a couple things Job has said throughout the book. There's too much to read here. I'm doing, how then could I answer him? Could I choose my words before him? For though I were right, I could not answer. I would have to implore the mercy of my judge. Job, in some ways, kind of knew what it would be like to talk to God, right? I mean, there in verses 14 and 15 here, you can see, if I called and he answered me, I could not believe that he was listening to my voice. Chapter 13, he says other things. Only two things do not do to me, then I will not hide from your face. He asks God to show him, where are my iniquities and my sins? And it's interesting. Job asks God to show him where his iniquities and sins are, and guess what God never does? Show him where his iniquities and sins are. So in some senses, when God shows up and doesn't say, hey, Job, here are your sins. In a sense, you might think, well, Job's like, maybe he'll vindicate me. And so maybe in Job's, as God shows up, the reason that he wanted to talk to God is because at the end of chapter 31 especially, he said, if I've done this, then punish me. If I've done that, then punish me. He lists off all these things, and God shows up, doesn't say any of those things, and doesn't punish him. And so in a sense, I think as scary as these verses are, I think there's also maybe immediately some question like, oh, did Job, maybe to Job, we know he didn't, but maybe Job's like, well, maybe I did or didn't. Anyway, we're speculating, but let's get into how God and Job both speak, because as God gets into his speech, the first thing he starts to talk about is creation, right? I want to compare and contrast and think about how God and Job both speak about creation, and ask ourselves, how does God's view of creation, what he actually starts to say to Job, how does it speak to Job's complaints? Okay, get another volunteer to read Job 38, 4-7 for us. Go ahead, Jesse.
Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who sets its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy.
Awesome, thank you. So, what does God start to say about creation? Maybe what's the tone of this? I mean, when God talks about creation, in what way is he talking about it? I'm the creator. I know these things, right? And so the questions are, what's the answer to these questions? Yeah, exactly. It's like, only you know, God. The right answer is only you know. And then at the end of it, God comments on what it was like. What was it like when God created everything in verse 7? What does he say? Yeah, the stars and the angels sang and shouted for joy. Contrast this. Remember how Job talked about creation? Did Job have such a cheery view of the world around him? When Job spoke about creation, did he say, everyone's so happy creation works this way? Here's some things Job said. On the day about his birth in Job 3, may that day be darkness. Let not God above care for it, nor light shine on it. Let darkness and black gloom claim it. Verse 9, particularly of chapter 3, let the stars of its twilight be darkened. God talks about creation. The stars are singing for joy, and the angels are too. And Job's like, the day I was born, the stars were darkened. Nothing is good. Nothing should be good. I feel horrible about it. Job 9 is even more clear. When he's talking about how God looks at the mountains, he removes them. When he overturns them in his anger, he shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble. He commands the sun not to shine. He sets a seal upon the stars. And all of this, again, he's looking around the world of creation and saying, there's just, in a sense, he's taking up a case against God. And when God starts to speak about creation, he says, this is actually what it is. Were you there, Job? And as you start to get into this, I mean, one of the questions we might ask is, what kind of tone do we believe that these rhetorical questions have? It's so funny trying to read tone out of these, isn't it?
It could be, I think if he was a human, it would be sarcastic.
Yeah.
But being that it's God, I'm sure he's above sarcasm.
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
Job and just explaining things to him.
Yeah, it can sound, if God weren't actually above everything, this would be so belittling if I asked you this. Hey, where were you when this happened, right? And it's like, well, we're both equals. But when God does, it's interesting. Actually, we can have a different tone. I think sometimes my initial reading of this might be condescending in the sense of, sarcastic or just belittling. And yet, what's interesting is the fact that God asks, most of his speeches are in rhetorical questions. I think it actually is inviting Job to consider again. And by extension, us, right? I mean, if God just said, hey, this is where you got it wrong, you're wrong here, you're wrong there, you're wrong, it's like, that would almost be more brutal, wouldn't it? If God just shows up and is like, here's all the things you've done and said wrong. But instead, there's kind of, as I read this, and Kim had her hand up over here, Dave, if you want to start making your way over. When I read this, is God's kind of inviting Job to appreciate him again. And this is all of God's answer to me as I read it. As difficult, as scary as the whirlwind is, as big and grandiose as God's answers are, I do see God inviting Job to appreciate him again. After everything Job has said about God, all the negative things he said about him, and God's like, hey, let's think about this together, Job. Who am I really? And I just think there's a beautiful grace in that. Kim, and then...
I was going to piggyback on what you were saying, but I think that you're right. If God had opened up and said, I did this, I did this, I did this, it's really not as humbling as asking the question. You feel like with every question that Job's just kind of like bowing his head, like, oh man. You don't get the sense that if he were pointing his finger and just demanding that he knew all this knowledge, that Job would maybe get the humility, but you feel like so ashamed for Job as he goes through all these questions, like Job must have felt this big after that, and not that, I just think it's so wise to go this direction than to just start declaring who you are, because Job knows who he was and who he is, but I just get this sense of like pure humility as this goes on.
Yeah, I agree. And then Brenna back there too. Yeah, I think one of the things, like, he's not berating him, right? That's where I was kind of looking for in this. And I think in the fact that God's asking these questions, it's almost like, I think, to me, it maybe even implies that Job can know these things, right? Not that he can know literally these answers, but that he can know this about God, that only God knows this, and that he can appreciate these. The fact that God asks these questions, I think, as rhetorical as they are, he's also implying to Job, you can know this about me, and you do know this about me. You did before all this, right? It serves as almost a reminder. Brenna?
I'm just going to add, not about the why it's questions, but just what's here. If you look at these verses compared to Genesis and the creation, God made the land. That's all we got.
Yeah.
Here, God is inviting Job to really understand what's a phrase in Genesis has this level of complexity for one portion of it, and it's helping Job, I think, Kim, like you were saying, there's so much here. God has so thoughtfully designed everything and takes care of everything that it opens up the rest of the conversation for Job to realize how God's hands have been through his whole life.
Yeah, I think that's so well put. Yeah, there's just, he's opening his eyes to see there's way more going on. You're very wise, Job, but there's actually a whole lot more going on than just you in this world. And so he's starting, and also I think one of the main points of God saying this, from a perspective of responding to Job's complaint, he's saying the world isn't as dark and bad as you think it is, man. Like, you have this view, and I think in a sense God understands why he has the view, but nonetheless, he's correcting him. When I created the world, everything was very good, joyful. The stars were shouting, the angels were shouting, everyone was happy about it. I was happy about it. And now you're not happy about it? You know, like there's kind of these questions in here. And so this gets to one of the other big questions Job has about God is his morality, right? Job has asked this question a lot. I mean, his friends have been, you know, this has been the question Job particularly has had a lot about God. And then in another section of this, after God talks about kind of birthing the seas and swaddling them in a diaper, which is super interesting imagery, in verses 8 through 11, he in verse 12 through 15 starts to talk about the dawn. And I want you to pay attention. How does God answer or talk about his morality and connect it to his creation in these verses? I think this is very, very interesting. Can I get a volunteer to read Job 38, 12 through 15? Go ahead, Dave.
Have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and they stand forth like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and the uplifted arm is broken.
Good, thank you. So how does God connect moral implications to dawn, and how does this answer Job's justice complaint, Job's complaint about God's justice? It may not answer it directly, but it's interesting. How does God start to connect morality or immorality, wickedness with dawn and the control of the days, the cycles of day and night? What do you think he's saying? It's funny, you know, there's things that we take for granted. Days coming, night coming. And darkness and night are often connected with sinfulness and wickedness. And God's saying, I'm in control of every day that dawns. I mean, Joshua makes this point clear by the opposite, right? They need more time. God makes the sun stand still. Imagine that. And people still think, this couldn't have literally happened because everything we've thrown off. It's like, yeah, but you're looking at it wrong. God is in control of these things. And by his power, by his mind and his involvement, the world keeps turning and days and night keep coming. What if there was an endless night? How much wickedness and evil, how much fear and darkness would spread. And God says, I bring the dawn every morning. Guess what? It's a message. It's a message in creation that God doesn't allow wickedness to go on forever. And it's a message to Job, right? You're in the night, the eternal night of your life. But guess what? I make the dawn to rise again. And there's something in this where he says, I know things are dark right now. Okay, this is not God. This is me talking about this, right? It might almost sound like this. I know things are dark right now, but I'm the one who brings the sun back every morning. In my very essence of how I created the world, there is a reminder that I care about these things. And so Job says, God, you're immoral. You're unjust. I don't deserve this. And God says, I've been caring about justice since I created the day and night. You know, it's interesting. And in the first one, he's talking about how great creation is. And here, even in the essence of creation, God's views and involvement with wickedness and righteousness, he says it's spoken there. This is called natural theology, by the way, reasoning about God from theology. I would have never made that conclusion, but God says that's what it says. And I think this is fascinating. I think it's beautiful. And it's a powerful thing. God's saying, look, consider this, that I really care about this. And I break the arm of the uplifted wicked man. I withhold the light from him. I shake the wicked out. And it's a part of the one who commands the morning and the dawn. Any thoughts about that? I think this is a really kind of thought-provoking revelation from God about his creation. Ricky, go ahead.
I was thinking that in spite of everything that Job had gone through and what he could have been thinking and what he could have said, even though he was, a little, and you said something a little bit earlier, grace. His grace is evident in what he tells Job about. Yep. Look, I understand what you're talking about. And my grace is sufficient for everything that you thought that wasn't right.
Yeah.
My grace is sufficient for what your friends thought they were right. Mm-hmm. No matter what you guys do or say, my ways are above your ways, my thoughts your thoughts.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we can read it, we can open up, you know, Job chapter, and the friends and everybody, you know, they couldn't or wouldn't or whatever.
Yeah.
It's beside the point. But when we read it, we too can be encouraged, just like what Jennifer was saying.
Yeah.
You know, when we're encountered with things and stuff here, there, and yonder, God's grace, even when we think something wrong, even when we might say something, he's got, don't work, you know, look, you're not me.
Yeah.
You don't understand what you're saying. You know,
Yeah.
what did Jesus say? Forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Yeah.
What did they do? What had they done?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, and so we have to be real careful,
Yeah.
you know, in our judgments with friends, family, or folk,
Yeah.
you know, and God knows the beginning of their you know, their stuff. He knows their end, just like us.
Yeah.
There's so much to it. And
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
This is like, it opens up so much that God has a mindfulness, and Brittany, you made this point too, like every little bit of creation, it speaks more than we even understand it. You know, the cycles of day and night, everything, like the way the seas, like the fact that there are limits on the seas, that they don't consume us all the time, you know? Like, have you ever been to the ocean and thought, it's like, it's so big, you know? I've been to the California coast, look at out the ocean, it's like unbelievable. And that's even just like, it's just a tiny percentage of the whole thing. And what stops it from coming up and just consuming us, right? It's one of the greatest fears we have right now is like a culture, right? Global warming, the sea levels are gonna rise, Florida's gonna be underwater. You know, it's like, we have all these fears, and it's like, yeah, why it stops it, you know? But this is, you know, this idea is all wrapped up in that God has grace and mercy wrapped up in all of creation. And the rest of the chapter, he starts to ask more rhetorical questions. And what's the implied answer to all these questions? Were you there? Do you know? No, no, no. What's the implication of that answer for Job? Why does God ask these questions, do you think?
He's implying that he was there and he did each one of these things.
Yeah.
He knows each one of these answers.
Yes. Yeah, he knows the answers to all this. He knows where the light comes from. He knows who cleft the channel for the flood. He knows everything. He knows where all these things come from and why they're there. And again, I think some of what God's asking these questions, he's like, Job, you know this. Why haven't you spoken like this? You know? How'd you forget this? And I think a lot of this is he knows, God knows. And I think it's part of the reason God doesn't impugn Job with any guilt is because he knows Job's heart through all this. Unlike the friends, unlike everybody else, even us, we might read and say, oh, God, Job shouldn't have said that. And he probably shouldn't have said some of the things he said, and yet God doesn't ever say that. And I think what God does instead is redirect him back to who he is, which, by the way, is an amazing thing to do in counseling or in encouraging fellow Christians or people who aren't just like, instead of lambasting them, reminding them how sinful and broken and foolish and dumb or whatever they are, we point them back to who God is, right? I mean, Job's friends, when they did that, they pointed God as this big, scary, like monster with no impunity. And the things they said about him were horrible. In fact, the pictures they painted of God weren't even correct. And so instead, maybe one of the answers, if we want to really learn from Job's friends and from God in the speeches, is have a better understanding of who God is and be able to speak that to life instead of really trying to focus in on all the foibles and faults of the people around us, right? Because that's what God just keeps saying, hey, don't you know who I am? Jesse?
It's like he keeps keeping on, right? Like just thing upon thing. And I mean, way more than he needs to, right? Probably, like, I mean, I don't mean to, like, criticize what God's saying, but, like, I mean, he just really, like, just keeps layering things on just to make a point intentionally, I believe, which is, I think for us, this isn't just about Job at this point, too. Like, this is also for us to understand the power of God. And you can't escape this reading without having far deeper appreciation for God than if Job was not in the Bible.
Yeah.
Like, I think this teaches us so much about the depth of God.
Yeah. Yes. And I think part of it is, like, in some sense, the way he asks the questions, like, you can know this too. And the fact that he asked Job these questions, he's by extension is asking us these questions, making the same point in the same way to us as if we're Job. And we can know this. We can see this to be true of our understanding of God. And so then after all this, he starts to get into these different creatures. And these different creation around him. And he begins with the ravens and the lions, but if you look through the whole list of animals, he talks about mountain goats, and he talks about wild donkeys and oxen and ostriches and ostriches? Ostrich? I can't say that word in plural. Ostriches. War horses and hawks. And to me, one of the things I read that I think helped me is he's kind of talking about animals that do what they want. Wild, chaotic animals. Like, there is a rhyme and a reason to some extent to some of the animals God chooses. And animals, by the way, that we might not want them to be taken care of. Think about a lion. You ever watch a National Geographic documentary and you're like, oh, the wild gazelles. And you're like, no, watch out, gazelle. And the lion strikes it and you're like, oh no, you're crying for the baby gazelle. And then the next episode, they're like, these lions haven't eaten in weeks. And you're like, no, the lions are gonna die. And then you're like all sympathetic for the lions. That's how God is, right? That's like, it's funny as we look at that. You can have sympathy for any animal. And when God looks at the lion and the ravens, like these, I'm like, I don't care if a raven eats. It's like, yeah, but God does. And there's an implication in all this. These animals, the ostrich lays its eggs on the ground for someone to crush it. What a dumb animal, bird brain, right? And yet God takes care of it. And there's still ostrich, okay, I'm not even trying to say it again. There's still those big birds around, right? There's an implication in all of this that these animals, the mountain goats, these solitary animals. You ever seen mountain goats up in the Cascades? They're like these solitary creatures off to themselves. What do they even eat up there? It's just rocks. And God takes care of them. There's an implication in all this where all these questions, he's not talking about the livestock or the animals he's like, these animals, have you ever thought about the fact that I take care of them? I'm the one who takes care of the hawk and the lion and the ostrich and all of these animals that you have no understanding of. How do I do that? All this chaotic world around us, the National Geographic where you're watching the gazelle and then you're watching the lion, how that all works out, how do the lions not just win? God is in control of all of that. He maintains it all. And again, he's making this point to Job, you don't know how small you are in this world. And the fact that I care deeply about every interaction of every, not just person, but the animals. It reminds me of Jesus who says, not one sparrow falls without the Lord knowing about it, right? All the very hairs of your head are numbered. I'm going through some of these very quickly. And so after all this, we have a few more minutes left. In chapter 40, do you notice what God calls Job? I love this. And then look at Job's response. God, in chapter 40, verse 2, he says, hey, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it. I think it's just such a, he's putting Job in his place to a certain extent, but also he is asking Job, like, do you have anything to say? I think this is, we can say like, God knew he wouldn't answer, but in a sense he is saying, hey, do you have any other questions? Do you want to respond to this? And what does Job say? I'm insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I've spoken, I will not answer. Even twice, I will add nothing more. Job's wise enough at this point to say, I'm not going to say a word. But he's not to the point where he says, I regret saying anything. Which, by the way, after the next speech of the Lord, Job will make a great confession of repentance. This speech wasn't enough for him yet. I think it's really important to see that in this book, to understand what's going on, why God speaks again, and the differences between God's first and second speech we're going to see next week as we get into it. It's really significant to see that Job doesn't fully kind of repent here. He just says, you know what, I'm going to keep listening. I'm here, I want to hear it, but I don't know what to think yet. I'm not fully convinced about this all yet. It seems to be to me as I read Job. And we're going to see more about next week, to be continued, I say, but wait, there's more. We're going to see next week how God speaks to Job more and kind of brings him to the final conclusion where Job finally gets it. But again, there's some kind of progression through this with Job. And I just want to point that out, but one more question, and we'll get to kind of the wrap up. How does God's character shine through in his response to Job, and how does God view his creation? Here's 3 big points, classic preacher thing to do, but there really are 3 points of the speech that need to be seen. First of all, the world that God has made has many more variables and considerations at play than Job has been accounting for. We made this point really well tonight. One of the people I read it said this: imagine you're paddling in a rowboat in the Pacific Ocean and a storm comes. And you're like, this Pacific Ocean is the worst ocean in the world. It's so stormy. I don't know why I'm on. It's like, the Pacific Ocean is huge. There's a lot of sunny spots in the Pacific Ocean the time that you're paddling in that rainstorm. And that, to some extent, is part of God's answer. It's not the full answer. If this was God's only answer, it would still seem pretty rude, or rude is such a poor word for this. It would seem like God is still pretty sadistic or uncaring for Job and just saying, well, hey, the world's a scary place. But also, God also says the world that God has made is orderly and very good, and God runs it as such. All these points about the lions, the ravens, the gazelles, the ostriches, this is the point God was making. Everything's really good. Again, we read Genesis 1. What did God say? God created it, and he said that it was good. And this is something that we can know from the very beginning, is that the world we live in is good. And by the way, there are so many viewpoints, philosophies today that preach that the world isn't. And they're poisonous viewpoints. And sometimes we think, oh, maybe, no, like we have to understand that the first thing that God says about the world is that it's good. And we have to have that worldview starting out, and that's the point he makes to Job as well. And then finally, the world that God has made has some allowable levels of chaos and evil. The lions have to eat, right? The predators have to eat, the hawk. But this does not imply that God doesn't care about justice or morality. And this, again, these three, any one of these on their own, or any two of them without the third, wouldn't answer Job sufficiently. But these three together paint a full picture, right? When we're suffering, and when Job is suffering through all this without any answer, why is this happening? It doesn't make any sense with what I know about God. God reminds him, the world's bigger than you understand. You have to remember who I am and the world that I've made. And finally, you have to appreciate the fact that there is chaos and evil and all of this wrapped up into my creation. And what we're going to see in chapter 2 is God's going to really dig in on that last point. That there's chaos and evil. And I think they're kind of manifested by these great creatures, the behemoth and the leviathan, that man can't do anything about. And God says, I've created these things. And I will conquer these things. And I think the whole point of God saying, the world we live in now, broken as it is full of chaos and evil, and that's a part of my creation. And God even says I'm okay with it. I created it. And yeah, he's going to say there's an implication. I think this is part of the reason he shows up as a warrior. I'm going to conquer it all. And I think this is part of what's going on in this whole book. Anyway, we'll get into all that discussion next week. I really appreciate your attention. And that's it for tonight.